Start recording. Okay.
Okay.
Hey, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Ankner. I'm the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Welcome to our program today, Newark and the Census, History of an Evolving City. Have you filled out your census form yet? Filling out the census is one small but very important thing everyone can do right now to help our city and our communities. If you haven't done so yet, please go to my2020census.gov and fill out the brief questionnaire. The information you provide affects funding for healthcare, transportation, your local schools, and many other needs. Remember, my2020census.gov. It is safe, secure, and confidential. Our guest today is Brendan Dan O'Flaherty, a professor of economics at Columbia University. Dan was born and raised in Newark. He worked for Newark City government in the early 1970s, serving as an assistant to the director of the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act program, better known as CETA. Is that how that was pronounced? CETA?
Yeah,
okay.
Like Wales.
Later, he got a PhD from Harvard and then taught at NJIT before joining the faculty at Columbia. He studies a wide range of urban issues, including homelessness and crime. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Tom.
Okay. I'm glad you could be here. So now you wrote a chapter for a book that came out last year about Kenneth Gibson, Newark's first African-American mayor. It provided a wealth of statistical data on Newark in the 70s and 80s when Gibson was mayor. You discuss inflation and the growth of the city economy, as well as population change, change in median income, and crime. Not all of that data came from the census, but it did illustrate how important statistics are to determining the condition of a city. Can you talk a little bit about why knowing this is important?
Okay. Knowing these things are important is because that's how the world really is. The world really is in numbers. It really is in how many people do this, how many people do that, what is going on. And unless you spend some time to think of what's going on, you can't just look at the world and say, oh, there are 102,000 people there, because your eyes don't see that. We have different processes for these things. And as I sort of emphasized in this story, most of the things that are really important in life, we can't see. Probably the most important thing that goes on this earth is photosynthesis. And that depends on the growth of plants. And this is springtime, you've been outside, you're seeing the plants come by, but you never see them actually grow.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
The important process, the thing that gives us oxygen, we don't see. We never see that happening. And those, to see that they're actually doing it, we have to say, oh, look, that tree is full of leaves today, and a month ago it was barren.
Yeah.
And that's the process that we look at. If we just stared at the tree for a year, for a month, we would go crazy, and we wouldn't see the important thing. The important thing is that the tree is now full of leaves, whereas it was empty before.
Yeah. Okay.
So we miss the important things. We're just not trained to see them. They happen at a scale that's different from what humans are used to dealing with.
So by studying data, by collecting data, we learn about the world, things that we're maybe sort of aware of, but not really entirely until we see the data in front of us, maybe?
Yeah, and like one of the things that I got from, I think, the 80 and 90 censuses was one of the most important things that happened in Newark between the 70s and 90s, which I've never heard anyone comment on, was the automobilization of the city.
Oh.
The number of cars in Newark between 70 and 90 skyrocketed.
Oh.
The number of people taking public transportation to work just went down tremendously. That has all kinds of, you've got parking problems now. You've got issues with congestion. You've got buildings like on South Orange Avenue and Clinton Avenue which were very popular because you could get the bus, are no longer very popular because you can get the bus. A lot of the things that went on in Newark at that time were tied to automobilization, which nobody saw. Another thing that happened in that time, which again you didn't see unless you looked at the census, is where people in Newark worked changed drastically. In 1960, 1970, the majority of people who lived in Newark worked in Newark. And that was taking the bus downtown by 1990, that had changed drastically. Something like 70 or 80% of the people in 1990 and still in the most recent censuses who live in Newark don't work in Newark. I mean, that changes what you think. That changes how you think politically. It changes the relationships in all kinds of ways, which nobody notices. You don't notice, oh, Mr. Jones down the street, he used to work at public service, but now he works at St. Barnabas.
Yeah.
That's not news. That's not something. But if it turns out that there are 30,000 Mr. Joneses, which you can't see because there's a Mr. Jones on this block and a Mr. Jones on another block, to get to the 30,000, then that makes a big difference.
And that has a profound impact on the kind of services provided in the city, because most of the people who work here don't live here, right? I mean,
yeah, and well, that was the case in 1960, 1952 also. But it was the change of where people who lived in Newark was the big change that came later.
Okay, I see. Okay, no, right, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. I mean, I've heard about how the majority of the people who work in Newark don't live here, but I hadn't that other.
I mean, I think what happened. I was living in Valesburg when I found that number.
Yeah.
And I remember that when I was growing up, everybody on the block worked downtown somewhere, things like that. So let me think through the block. And when I thought through the block in 1990, there was practically nobody who worked in Newark.
Huh. Oh, wow. Goodness. Okay. So what kinds of data are acquired through the decennial census, through the 10-year census?
The decennial census has changed many, many times and will change many times again. The direct data that go into the decennial census are very sparse. They are who lives here, what is their race, what is their ethnicity, how old are they, and I believe there is how are they related.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there's nothing. But that doesn't mean that the census is not used over and over again. The rich kind of data, the data on income, the data on poverty, the data on journey to work, the data on employment are developed through surveys, large surveys that are meticulously done. But of maybe 1%, 3% of the population. But in order to set up the sampling frame, to figure out how you sample, how you weight the samples, the decennial census forms the basis to set up the samples and to weight the samples. So it's the key ingredient in the other kind of data, one of the key ingredients in the other kind of data.
So without an accurate decennial census, it affects the accuracy of those other.
It affects of all those other numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Okay. So how do you use census data in your research on urban issues?
Direct census data, best time. I use it whenever I need it. It's like, it's always there.
You probably use it all the time, right? Yeah.
I use it all the time. It's like, you know, you're asking me, how do you use butter?
Okay, all right. So maybe
Well, I put it on. Okay, so when I'm okay, so lately I've been looking at police homicides. So one of the key things is, one way that people like to look at these things is, what is the rate of police homicide per number of civilians in an area or different places. I mean, it turns out there are like tremendous differences by geography and things like that, which you wouldn't know unless you had the census. So a non-Hispanic white individual living in Albuquerque is much more likely to be killed by police than an African American living in New York City.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
You have to have the numbers on the basis to do that.
Yeah.
And you can also see, one of the things I'm trying to develop as part of that is, what is the ratio of police officers to civilians? You have to have the census to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So in anything that you want to come up with some metric, if you want to compare New York City to Albuquerque, which you ought to do, you ought to try to compare New York City to Albuquerque. One of the big interesting questions is how in many different ways is New York City different from Albuquerque? You need some common metric, and one of the most common ones is population. Mm-hmm. Well, you could do it per street light, but I'm not sure what street light would be.
Okay, all right. So collecting this data, I mean, we talked a little bit about this already. How does collecting this data aid the people of Newark, help the people of Newark?
Let me talk about a couple of the ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Some of which are obvious. If you're going to have if the people making decisions are going to have an accurate picture of who lives in Newark, this is how. Mm-hmm. Let us hope sometime in the near future that there is a vaccine for coronavirus. Then you're not going to get 300 million doses of that manufactured overnight. Yeah. There is going to be some process about who gets it first. Probably there would be some priority for seniors at that point. If you don't know how many seniors there are in Newark, how many doses of the vaccine are you going to get for the seniors of Newark?
Good point. Yeah.
So if you are a senior hoping to get the vaccine, if you're not counted, nobody knows you're there. Mm-hmm. So you should do yourself a favor and get yourself counted, so that when the vaccine comes around, somebody's saying, oh, we need 9,000 vaccines for the seniors in the South Ward. Mm-hmm. And not go to the South Ward with 5,000 vaccines and say, oh, there are a bunch of senior citizens we didn't know about in the South Ward. And then we have a big scramble and then another, very, very dangerous, very, very terrible process of running out of vaccines for the seniors in the South Ward before we run out of seniors in the South Ward. Okay. So that kind of thing is important. A lot of people are talking about testing, how we need to be testing 2 to 6% of the population. Mm-hmm. on a very regular basis. And you're going to need tests. Everybody in Newark is going to get tested, or we're going to have 5 or 6% of the people in Newark tested regularly. We have to know how many people there are. Yeah, yeah. And if we want to deal with the people who, if we want to deal with seniors first, if we want to deal with people who are going to work, we have to know how many people are going to work, how many people are in jobs that expose themselves, that are dangerous, how many are essential workers on the front lines in grocery stores, in the police department, in many other areas where we're relying on people.
Mhm.
You're going to test them, you got to know how many there are and where they are.
Yeah.
The other thing which I sort of thought of, after 70 years, the manuscript census is public. For many people, that's their only record.
Mhm.
I've been looking at manuscript census data from 1930, and you can now link people. You can see what people's lives are. So all sorts of people who would have absolutely disappeared from history are there.
Yeah. Yeah, I do a lot of genealogical research, and I use with what genealogists call the name census all the time. The most recent one available is 1940 right now, and we use it. I use it in my work here at the public library, but I also use it when I do genealogical research on my own family or for other people. And we're actually having a session on that next week. 2 genealogists to talk about how genealogists use census information, and it's very important too. Yeah. But
It's also important to economists and historians. Like, I mean, how did Newark get populated? Where did the people who lived in Newark in 1900 come from?
Yeah.
Without the census, there's no way of knowing that.
Yeah. Where were you born? That was that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. So there's the '67 rebellion of Newark is kind of a important marker in our history here. Can you talk a little bit about how Newark has changed since the time of the '67 rebellion? First of all, the change in the population, not only in the absolute number of people who live here, but also changes in the racial makeup and the socioeconomic status of the city.
It's changed incredibly. There's no relationship in many ways. The proportion of African Americans is about the same. Went up, it went down. The proportion of immigrants is way up. And what you may not have noticed, the proportion of educated people is way up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And in 1970, 1960, about 5 or 6% of the population of Newark was college educated.
Oh.
Now we're pushing 20. High school education was a big thing. Many more high school graduates. People are much healthier, much stronger. There's enormously less alcoholic drinking. Alcoholism is way down since the 60s and 70s. And if Newark is like the rest of the population, we're smarter. Average IQ in the United States for whites has been going up by about 3 points per decade since 1900. For African Americans, it's been going up about 4 points per decade. The average person in 1930 would be kind of slow today. Part of that is because we have more exposure. Okay, we have much less exposure to lead. That's part of the story of why we're smarter.
Yeah.
We have much less exposure to other toxins. We're just more used to talking in scientific terms. We have different grasp of the world. So we're really much smarter. Because of the library, but because of much other things.
Yeah, yeah.
There is that change. There's change in life expectancy. Life expectancy is up by, I think, about 7 to 10 years since the 60s. Most obviously, nobody smokes anymore.
Mm. Yeah.
If you were on a bus in 1960, I remember taking the 54 bus in 1966, and it was full of smoke.
Yeah, yeah. And movie theaters and a lot
Movie theaters, yeah,
of people just don't smoke anymore. Yeah,
yeah,
bars, restaurants. Yeah,
yeah. So in a lot of ways, we're a lot better.
mm-hmm. Okay.
Not in every way,
Yeah, yeah.
but we haven't learned to get along better with the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we're a lot better in many other ways.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's good. It's a unique view. It's not a view you hear very often in popular culture. So it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about that. So for several decades, beginning even before the rebellion, the population in Newark had been dropping. How did that population change affect the services available to people in the city?
They didn't so much change the services as they changed who delivered it. So you had a vast change in who did things. If you go back to the late 1920s, there was state aid in the late 1920s. It consisted of the city of Newark sending money to Trenton.
Oh, okay.
And Newark had many services which have moved out over time. Newark had a tuberculosis home, which is up in Cedar Grove. We don't have a tuberculosis home anymore. Newark had a poor farm, which is now Ivy Hill. Newark was in charge of all types of relief. That was part of why Newark went bankrupt in 1934. There was no welfare from the state. There was no welfare from the federal government. It was Newark. Newark had a subway system completed at that time. Newark, there was no Medicare. There was no Medicaid. So you didn't go on Medicaid and go to a nursing home when you got old. You went to Ivy Haven, which Newark ran. Newark City Hospital was the primary healthcare deliverer up until the 1960s when it went to the state, came UMDNJ. Newark was running its own division of welfare up until the 2000s. But what is now the Essex County Division of Welfare in 1960 was the Newark Division of Welfare. So in one area after another, services have gone to different places. The Newark City government is a small shadow of what it was in 1930. But the other part, county government and state government and federal government have grown to replace a lot of things that the Newark City government was doing.
And so that would be a direct result of the declining population in the city? Or factors, of course.
It's probably more a direct result of the declining number of factories in the city.
Okay.
This was financed by property taxes on factories.
Okay. Okay. Can you talk about your personal experiences working for Newark City government in the 70s? You worked for an agency that sought to find public sector jobs for low-income people. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
How did census data influence that job?
Well, how much money we got depended on employment data, which was derived from the census. So the fact that we had, well, in the fact that we had 2,000 jobs rather than 1,000 jobs was because of the census.
Hmm. Okay. Because there was more of a need because of the
Yeah,
population, because of the population.
yeah,
Okay.
it was a formula.
Okay. Okay. In the last couple of decades, Newark's population has begun growing again, a little bit. Why is it important for us to have accurate information on how much it is growing? I mean, we're kind of circling back.
I don't think that's accurate. That's important. And the census is going to be off by 3 to 4% anyway.
Okay.
And you're talking about small numbers. I mean, you really don't look at the census as more than 3 or 4 significant digits, and you're talking about things in 5th or 6th significant digits. One of the things that people misunderstand what the census is. The census is a snapshot of who is where on April 1. Wherever people were on April 1, they're not there now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an approximation.
Mm-hmm.
So you shouldn't get obsessed about that level of accuracy, but because it's not that accurate, but you should try to participate in the great process. And this is what we do in this country. We participate in this process. We vote in an election, even though our vote is not going to be decisive.
Mm-hmm.
We pick up litter. We refrain from littering on Broad Street, even though that is not going to make a great deal of difference. This is what we do in this country. It's one of our great civic rituals.
Okay. Yeah. So now we talked a little bit about how census data can be used in efforts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, talked about having the right number, right population figures in terms of determining how much testing should go on, and et cetera. Are there any other ways in which it can aid?
Well, partly now it's because of the census. We know that Newark is hard hit.
Mm-hmm.
We can compare Newark, I think, is 5,000 cases now, with Albuquerque. Because Albuquerque is about the same size as Newark. We know that because of the census.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that, okay, it's not just that there are a lot of people in Newark, it's that relative to other cities the same size, relative to the rest of New Jersey, that people in Newark are more likely to be afflicted by COVID and to die from COVID. We know that because we have these basic census numbers to begin with.
Mm.
And we know that the state of New Jersey is focusing more efforts on Newark because of that. And anybody who wants to do something knows, you come to Newark, there are other places to go to. I mean, there are serious problems in New Orleans. There are serious problems in the Navajos. But Newark is one of the places where you ought to be if you're going to be addressing this problem. And that's what the census tells us.
Yeah. You recently mentioned a term to me that I was not familiar with, sampling frames. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to the census?
Okay, so let's talk about how we get the number for unemployment, because we see that number and that's moving all over the place. Okay. We get the number from unemployment because the Bureau of Labor Statistics samples, I don't know the correct number, but say 20,000 households in the country. And they have a big questionnaire. They go to those households and they say, are you looking for work? Do you have a job? When was the last time you looked for work? Are you looking for part-time work? So they have a detailed questionnaire. That they take the results from those questionnaires and they weight them in various fashions. And when you see the headline, which you'll probably see Friday, that says unemployment in March rose to 10%. That's where they get it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do they pick those samples? They divide the country up into lots of little squares, lots of little boxes, and they randomly pick people in each of the little boxes. They know how big those little boxes are from the census, and they know how much to weight the people that they chose in that little box in the census, and they've devised their ideas of which little boxes and how many people they choose in each little box from what the census tells them about where people are.
Okay.
And then they update that as their updates from the census over the next 10 years. The number that you will see on Friday about unemployment in the United States is derived by a huge, complicated process from the 2010 census. That's one of the things that goes into cooking the numbers to come up with that. In a very sophisticated, very professional way. People who do this are really very, very good.
Okay. Can you talk about some of the innovative uses being made of historical census data today? And we talked a little bit about the name census.
So what's possible now because of artificial intelligence is 1890 census was lost. But if you want to, up until now, it's been impossible you can get a snapshot of the population in 1910 and a snapshot of the population in 1900, but you don't know how those two things relate to each other. Some of the people who were here in 1910 weren't here in 1900 and vice versa. Especially if you take a geographical area like Newark. What people have started to do is that they can now link people from one manuscript census to the other. They can link large numbers of people. So for instance, we have the first really sophisticated estimates, and I won't go by these because they're one of the first of this. How many African Americans passed in 1880, 1890, 1900? We have no way of knowing what kind of people. There's now work by Emily Nix and Nancy Sheehan at Yale, where they're attempting to get this number by tracing people who listed themselves or were listed, because it was at that point race was done by the census taker. People whom the census taker said were Black in 1880 who appear as white in 1890. And this, things like 5 or 10% of people in some of these times over a 4-year period. I guess one of the things is it appears mainly to be when you move someplace else. You're Black in Alabama in 1880, you're white in Oklahoma in 1890. To do that, you just have to crunch enormous amounts of data. The other thing that we're taught that a former student of mine is working on is how suburbanization happened in New York City in this period. So the traditional story, because if you just look at snapshots, is that starting in the 1880s, 1900s, rich people from the center of the city moved to the suburbs, or Queens or Brooklyn, which were the suburbs at that time. And you read the history books, and that's what the history books say. But they never saw anybody actually move, because they only have the two pictures. So what Seung Kong Lee has been doing is she's linked everything in New York City from 1870 to 1930. And what she found is that wasn't the case. The people who stayed in the center of the city, the richest people in the center of the city stayed in the center of the city. And they didn't move to the suburbs. What happened was that it was all immigration. That basically rich people from outside New York moved to the rich suburbs of New York, whereas the rich people in the center stayed. And poor people from outside New York moved to the center of New York.
Okay.
So it wasn't the story of what we thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can only see this now because we can link people over the census data. And that's really amazing. I mean, it changes your picture of what happened. I mean, I would.
Oh, sure.
Son can do Newark, and I'm trying to get her to do Newark pretty soon. And was it the question of rich people leaving Newark, or was it a question of was it rich people leaving Newark for Livingston, or people from the rest of the world moving to Livingston?
Yeah, I mean, the story that's told about Newark is beginning in the 20s, right? That the wealthier people began leaving suburban towns.
We don't know that. Nobody knows that. Until you start linking data. It may be that the wealthier people stayed and just other people moved in. And there's just incredible, if you follow cities in this period, there's like incredible movement. And compare 1920 to 1910, almost nobody who was living in New York in 1920 was living in New York in 1910.
Oh, wow. Good. Wow. That's interesting. So I wanted to open this up to some of the other people here today in the Zoom room. So people, if you can either use the raise hand function, or you can type a question in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand on the screen, and I will see if I can see anybody raising their hands. If anybody wants to ask, anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? I see some people here. I don't see anybody. Let's see. Nobody has a question, it looks like. So there was one other thing I wanted to ask you, Dan. We talked a little bit about, when we were talking on the phone 2 weeks ago, maybe, you mentioned that, that Orange and South Orange changed their form of government, their municipal designation over the last few decades. And that was kind of related to their changing population. Can you kind of explain that?
Okay, so in the 1970s, Richard Nixon had this thing called revenue sharing, which was the federal government giving unrestricted grants to different kinds of municipalities. And that was basically a nonlinear formula. It was, I think, inverse per capita income squared. But it had in most of the country, not New Jersey, there's a big difference between townships and cities. And so the census, the revenue sharing had one category for townships and one category for cities, and other things like villages. In New Jersey, and especially in Essex County, the city category was dominated by Newark. So if you were a village, you didn't get much money. If you were a city, you didn't get much money, because the nonlinearity made all of the money come to Newark. But if you were a township, you were in a different game. You weren't competing with Newark. And so it was advantageous to be in the township bracket in Essex County. So the village of South Orange, which has always been called the village of South Orange, is officially now the township of the village of South Orange. And Orange, which is always a city, is now officially the township of the city of Orange. It doesn't make any difference anymore, but in the 1970s, they made some money off that.
Okay, that's interesting. So we did get one question. We're actually a couple of questions. One question is, when was race first included in the census and why was it included?
1790, because that's what the United States was about.
Yeah. So it's always been, ever since the
It's
first.
always, it's part of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
The 3/5 rule is part of the Constitution. If you're going to apportion states, you're going to apportion seats in Congress based on the 3/5 rule,
Mm-hmm.
then you've got to find out who's a 3/5 and who's not a 3/5.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
So it's always been part of it. And the definitions of race have changed rather substantially. The words for race have changed. Yeah, the other thing is that Native Americans are also in the Constitution, so they have to be counted differently in various times.
Mm-hmm.
So Native Americans and African Americans are in the Constitution. The Constitution sets up the census. That's how things are.
Yeah. Okay. So another question we got. You talked about surprising things in the 1970s through the 1990s censuses. What things surprised you when studying earlier census data?
I guess the biggest surprise in earlier census data came when I was in college and I was hanging around with the 1890 census. The 1890 census is wonderful. It was the first use of cards, punch cards. What really struck me as odd about the 1890 census was that they had table after table of crosstabs, because this is the first time they could do crosstabs. And it sort of tells you, you learn, the only way to really learn a society is by what numbers it collects. So I think I learned everything I needed to know about the 1890 US when I saw that they devoted many, many pages to tables of idiots by altitude.
Idiots by altitude?
Yes. This was a great concern. If you're...
I know idiot had a different meaning in 1890 than it does today.
No. Oh, altitude means, okay. So this is, you're still you're in a age when epidemics matter, when yellow fever and cholera sweeps through, and you're also under the impression of the miasma theory of disease. So altitude tells you how healthy a place is. So the 1890 census is absolutely obsessed with altitude. You learn a lot about people from that. Idiots, you're in the beginning of social Darwinism. You're thinking in Darwinian terms. So you're obsessed by sorting people into these genetic boxes. So if you want to look at the mindset of an educated person of 1890, an educated person of 1890 is fascinated by idiots by altitude, which I think tells you more about 1890 than any number of novels that you would want to read.
Yeah, okay, right.
And it tells us, I mean, as Eric Holder emphasized, it tells us something important about the United States, that we don't have official data on police homicide when civilians are killed by police. And what we collect and what we don't collect tell us more. You know, I'm sure that people 100 years from now will look at how we collected data and say, what was on those people's minds?
Yeah. Why did they collect certain things and not other things? Yeah. All right, well, it looks like nobody, here we go. Okay, so the library is actively trying to get the citizens of Newark counted. How can we relay its importance? Do you have any ideas about how we can do that?
Just say it's important. You're here, and this is
Yeah.
important. This is what everybody does. I wouldn't so much emphasize that we're going to get rich off this. I would say, you know, if you're interested in getting tested for COVID, if you're interested in being counted in the vaccine, you better know where you are. This is absolutely confidential for the next 70 years. After 70 years, who cares? When did they stop recording occupation? I mean, I would just emphasize that it's your duty. You may not be a citizen, you may not be documented, but what COVID has taught us is it doesn't matter, right? We're all Newarkers, we're all people in this country together, and COVID goes everywhere, the census goes everywhere.
So, Bill Chappell, you have a question. I'll unmute you. Can you want to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, there's a little bit of interference, but we can hear you.
This is the first time on Zoom, so I don't know what I'm doing. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
I'm listening on my cell phone, watching on my new iPad, because I couldn't hear on the iPad. Anyway, as far as census is concerned relating to Newark, what does it tell us about gentrification? And is there a difference between Center City and the outer boroughs? We don't have boroughs.
Okay, census itself won't, the decennial census itself won't tell us anything about gentrification because it contains no information about income or education or these things that we want to mark. It will tell us about race. If the information on education, occupation, income, which is the basis of the gentrification stories, will be available in the American Community Survey, which is sort of a stepchild of the census, which is a sampling which takes place over time. But the sampling is based on the sample from the census. So the American Community Survey information comes out every year, and then they have 5-year summaries. But that will have to be redone to hit the new benchmarks of the 2010 census or 2020 census. So you'll see the first results from that probably around 22, 23 when the American Community Survey comes out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go. Would you say something else? Okay, I was the person who had asked the question about the occupational information had a follow-up. She said, in the past, they indicated a person's occupation on the census. Now they don't ask it, right? That's what she was referring to.
Yeah. Okay. So that's about the same answer. Up until 2000, there was a 5% and a 1% sample in the decennial census, where they asked things like occupation, education, journey to work, nativity, very long.
The long form versus the short form.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
That stopped in 2000.
Okay.
And there's only a short form now. What was on the long form got transferred to the American Community Survey, which is an ongoing survey of a little bit bigger than the long form used to be, which publishes its information on an annual and a 5-year basis on smaller geographical areas. And I mean, the good thing is it publishes serious standard errors, which the census really wasn't very good about publishing standard errors.
Okay. Well, that is our program. Newark and the Census, History of an Evolving City. Thank you, Dan, for doing this today.
Okay.
This was really nice. Okay. Okay, so I just want to remind everyone again that please fill out your census form at my2020census.gov. I'd like to thank Dan again for joining us today. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended the session. We have a few other programs coming up that might interest you. On Thursday, May 14th, two genealogists will be here to talk about how census information helps with genealogical research. That's on Zoom at 1 p.m. on May 14th. This Friday, we will be marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day by a discussion with two historians of New Jersey's military history. That's Friday at 1 p.m. on Zoom. And tonight, for something a little different, we will be showing a one-man show by Jesse Bernstein, whose grandfather was the personal physician to Newark mobster Longy Zwillman in the 1950s. That's tonight on Facebook Live at 7 p.m. For more information on these programs, check the Newark Public Library website at npl.org. Stay safe, everyone. Bye, Dan.
Bye, Tom.